Today's session is Behar. That's spelled B apostrophe Har. Apparently, there's no E in the Hebrew language. So we just want to make sure that everybody knows that. But if you see it spelled Behar, that's fine. It means on the mount. And the conversation begins in Leviticus 25. But what's interesting is it starts, everyone turn to Leviticus 25 if you have your Bible. I'm reading from the Good News Translation. And the first phrase says, at verse 25:1, the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai and commanded him to give the following regulations to the people of Israel. If you read your word and you're a scholar, you're probably thinking, what are we doing at Mount Sinai? We've already come out of Egypt, and so he led them to Mount Sinai and he gave those different rules and regulations. So some people like to look at the word Behar as on the mount, but if this conversation is happening at Mount Sinai between God and Moses, for him to transfer to the people, he was a little bit inside the mount. I'm thinking the cleft of the rock, or wherever he was sitting where he was writing all those rules and regulations. But it's just semantics, okay? He's at Mount Sinai talking to God. That's amazing enough. So this section, as far as like an overview, I think we have an overview of the different things we'll be talking about today. And can you guys see the PowerPoint? Is it coming through on the feed?
It's light,
No,
but
I
they
don't
can
want you
see
to turn
it.
the light off. I just want to make sure Sean worked hard. She loves her PowerPoints. So I want you guys to be able to see it, but I'm going to just keep moving. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is the 7th year, which we're reading. So the Torah portion is Leviticus 25, that whole chapter, to chapter 26, verses 1 and 2, and it ends there. So it's just one chapter today as far as the Torah portion. And it starts talking about the 7th year, and anybody who's been in Jesus for half a second knows the 7th year should indicate a Sabbath. And so this is a very big Sabbath. It's not a Sabbath made for man, it's a Sabbath made for the land. So the Israelites were instructed every 7 years they were to let the land rest. Fully, completely. They were an agricultural community, so they would be harvesting. Well, they would plant their seeds, grow their crops, and then, of course, it would be harvest time once the fruit had produced. But in the 7th year, they were commanded to do nothing. So let's start our reading. I don't think I'll read the whole section, but I do want us to have context. So the Lord spoke at verse 1 of chapter 25 to Moses on the Mount Sinai and commanded him to give the following regulations to the people of Israel. When you enter the land that the Lord is giving you, you shall honor the Lord by not cultivating the land every 7th year. So that's our pretext. Every 7 years, this land has got to rest. Amen. And it's not just to benefit the land. It's not just so the land can be replenished and renewed, nourished, and get all that good stuff back from those 6 years where you were digging, planting, watering. Hopefully it was growing, and then you can pull from that. It was to honor God. So verse 3, you plant your fields, prune your vineyards, and gather your crops for 6 years. But the 7th year is to be a year of complete rest for the land, a year dedicated to the Lord. A year dedicated to the Lord. If you highlight, this is the whole point of this. It's a Sabbath for the land, and you dedicate the entire land that you enter into to God. Remember when we were last here, we talked about Kedoshim, which is be holy for I am holy. That's God talking to us. Now we skipped a portion, but we're moving into Behar, and he's saying, when you enter this land that I'm bringing you to, it's talking about the land of Canaan, you've got to dedicate it every 7 years to me, and there's a reason for it. So at verse 4, But the seventh year is to be a year of complete rest for the land, a year dedicated to the Lord. Do not plant your fields or prune your vineyards. Do not even harvest the grain that grows by itself without being planted. And do not gather the grapes from your unpruned vines. It is a year of complete rest of the land. So in Hebrew, this seventh year is called Shemitah. And I'm going to spell it. I have a paper with the spelling. S-H, spell Shemitah for me, Sean. Yes, S-H-M-I-T-A. And there's a slide, if we can get some help with the slides. The Sabbath year, the Shemitah, if you can see that. So they still add the E's, and that's just probably for the English. But that's how it's spelled. But it's S-H-M-I-T-A-H, which is Shemitah, which just means the seventh year is a holy Sabbath to the Lord where the land completely rests. That's how you define it. If anybody asks you, what is Shemitah? Okay? So that's what this first section is, and it's going on in verses 5, 6, and 7 to say everything rests. The land rests. You're not digging, you're not pruning, you're not doing anything, but you are able to be provided for completely in this sixth year. Okay? So backtrack from the seventh Shemitah year. In that sixth year, God is doing something amazing. So if you skip to chapter in 25 to verse 18, it shows you God is saying, obey all the laws that he's commanding you regarding this Shemitah year. The land will produce its crops, and you will have all you want to eat, and you will live in safety. And some people, of course, in God say, how? How's it going to do that? In verse 21, God's saying, I will bless the land in the sixth year so that it will produce enough food for 2 years. So it's some people like to call it a double portion, but that's not actually correct. Amen. Because God blesses the sixth year to produce for you in the sixth and the seventh year, but then people are asking in verse 22 of the same chapter, when you plant your field in the eighth year, you will still be eating what you harvested in that sixth year. So it's more accurate for you to think of this as a triple bounty from God. You will be eating from the sixth year for the sixth, seventh, and the eighth year, because in that sixth year, you will be gathering everything. Think of Joseph gathering all that stuff for that famine they were going through. You will be gathering everything, and you will be able to eat that for those 3 years. And then you will also be able to plant in that eighth year and be eating off of that abundance. So I like to think of Proverbs chapter 3. Okay, if you want to go there with me, so you can have that in your mind. When God is saying, I'm going to bless you real, real good, he means it. He says in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Never rely on what you think you know. Don't try to analyze God's principles from your human mind. Do it from your Christ mind. Remember the Lord in everything you do, and he will show you the right way. When he's telling us to honor these principles in verse 18, this is what he's saying. Remember me. Never let yourself think you are wiser than you are. Simply obey the Lord and refuse to do wrong. And then skip down to verse 9 of Proverbs chapter 3. When you honor the Lord and make him an offering from the best of that land that's producing, he will fill your vats. Well, I'm in the Good News Translation. If you do, your barns will be filled with grain, and you will have too much wine to store it all. So this is that abundance that God is telling us about, where he's blessing the sixth year so much it flows all the way to the full eighth year. So God is so good. But that's Shemitah year. That's the seventh year. And is dedicated to the Lord, which is why I wanted us to see that Proverbs chapter 3 and 9. Honor the Lord. It says with your substance, with whatever you have in that seventh year, and he will bless you. All right, so now we're going on to the next section, the next big section in Leviticus, in this portion of Behar. and it starts at verse 8, 25 verse 8. And so our header is the year of Jubilee. Now, I had so many jokes as I was preparing this session about a certain preacher who declared and proclaimed the year of Jubilee. And that was this huge movement in the Christian community. But I'm not saying the person was inaccurate, but we're going to look at it from a Hebrew perspective, and I will save the jokes. The year of Jubilee, as we all should know, is talking about that 50th year. So the year of Jubilee in Hebrew is Yovel, which is Y-O-V-E-L. These E's are everywhere. But Yovel means Jubilee year. And so let's get some context. We all know it's the 50th year. There's some type of blessing in there, and I want to get in on it. Okay? I feel like the Jubilee message was coming out when I was around 15 years old or something. But I didn't know anything about the Hebrew spin on it. But now, in verse 8, it says, count 7 times 7 years, which equals 49. They're so kind they do the math for you. Then on the 10th day of the 7th month, the Day of Atonement, send someone to blow a trumpet throughout the whole land. In this way you shall set the 50th year apart and proclaim freedom to all the inhabitants of the land. During this year, all property that has been sold shall be restored to the original owner or the descendants, and any who have been sold as slaves shall return to their families. You shall not plant your fields or harvest the grain that grows by itself or gather the grapes in your unpruned vineyards. The whole year shall be sacred for you. You shall eat only what the fields produce of themselves. And it goes on, I'll just finish reading. Well, I'm not going to go into it. So the rest of the text is talking about how all of the property is being restored back to those original owners. So when you think of Jubilee, think about God is restoring back property. It's really property law. Let's just read it. In this year, all property that has been sold shall be restored to its original owner. So when you sell land to the Israelite or buy land, do not deal unfairly. When you read your Torah portion, your first 5 books of the Bible, always think about what's the principle God is telling me and teaching me. How will it apply to my natural life, and what's the spiritual concept behind it? So this is talking about don't deal unfairly with these property transactions. In verse 15, the price is to be set according to the numbers of years the land can produce crops before the next year of restoration. So in that next 50-year window, however much that land should be able to produce should be how much it costs. You know, and if you go and study this Torah Portion-B'ehar on your own, you'll see a lot of controversy about how no one's following those principles. They're not even sure if the Israelites follow the principles, you know, because they go on and say, don't be unfair in dealing with the Israelites. But everybody else, they put that in there. You can do what you want with. But that's not what God intended. God intended the year of Jubilee to be that 50th year that was sacred. So how is unfair dealing on any level fitting in there? Okay, it's not. And you were to deal with people according to what the land was valued at, not what you think it should be valued at, not what you want it to be valued at. You're not trying to get a windfall. You're honoring a principle. Amen. So let's keep reading. Okay, at 16, if there are many years, the price will be higher, but if there are only a few years, the price shall be lower. So it goes on to keep talking about that. Now let's skip to verse 23, because like I told you, verses 18 and up to 22 is still talking about the 7th year where the land is resting. Now we're talking about this sacred 50th year where there's restoration for the community. So your land at verse 23 must not be sold on a permanent basis because you do not own it. It belongs to God, and you are like foreigners who are allowed to make use of it. So think about property. God says in his word he owns the earth. He owns 1,000 cattle on 1,000 hills. He owns everything. So he says, do not think you own anything. I own everything. So when I give you property, I'm telling you, you have to give it back to me. It's restored back to the original owner, and God is the original owner. When land is sold, the right of the original owner to buy it must be recognized. If any of you Israelites becomes poor and are forced to sell your land, your closest relatives can buy it back. So if you have a minute to look at the homework or the supplement we provided to you, there's a little note in there about the kinsman redeemer. And if that word, you should trigger your brain as many times as Sean has taught us about the story of Ruth and Boaz. That kinsman redeemer process was a transfer of land back to the original owner. Even though they were talking about, the husband died, now the brother or the closest relative, as my text says, is supposed to show up and offer that person the opportunity for them to restore their land back. If you read in your Haftorah, that whole section with Jeremiah is talking about how God told him about the captivity in Babylon, which lasts for 70 years. And one of Jeremiah's relatives said, hey, we're about to be sold because, this war is not working out. We're losing. Can you take my land? I don't have the money to sell it back. And Jeremiah's going back, I don't want your worthless piece of land, but I honor God and all of his principles. So yeah, let's write this thing down. And he did the whole thing legal. He got the proof put in, had witnesses and everything to sign those documents, put it in a hidden away place that no one wants to tell us where it is, but God knows. And that land belongs to the Israelites. So he honored that kinsman redeemer principle. Boaz honored that kinsman redeemer principle with Ruth, but it was all to allude to Jesus. Okay? Let's turn to Luke 4, verse 14. This is property law, and the property belongs to God. So in Luke verse 4, Jesus, and verse 14, Jesus came back to Galilee full of the Holy Spirit. That's what my text says. And then he goes into the temple at verse 16. It says Jesus went to Nazareth where he had been brought up. He went back home. And it was a Sabbath. And he went as usual. I highlighted that. To the synagogue. See, he was a devout Jew. Every time the Pharisees were coming against him, they weren't winning because Jesus knows his own law. He follows his own practices. He was at the usual place, at the usual time. Synagogue on Sabbath, okay? And then he goes on and he reads in verse 18. The text, we know this, back and forward, the Spirit of the Lord. Everybody, let's read it together. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has chosen me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and to recovery of sight to the blind, to set free the oppressed and announce that time has come. That time. He's come to announce it. When the Lord will save his people. Jesus rolled up that scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. That's what they say, drop the mic, right? Back in the synagogue, he gave them back the scroll after he read that text, which we know is from Isaiah 61. And it's not anything other than prophecy witnessing to what God was going to do. But what is so amazing, if we keep reading, all the people in the synagogue had their eyes fixed on him. And then Jesus said, what I just read has come true today, as you heard it being read. That's God right there. That's a Selah. He just proclaimed the year of Jubilee. People want to do the math and stuff. I'm not doing the math. I believe that when he said it was the 50th year of Jubilee proclamation, and when he spoke, this is what's happening right now, Jesus was becoming that word that does not return void unto God, but it accomplishes everything that God intends it to do. We just learned that the 50th year of Jubilee is about a restoration. It's about returning that property to the original owner. And if you read in your Torah portion, it's also about the release of those people that were so poor they couldn't afford to buy their land back. They had to sell themselves into slavery in order to earn money for their families so that they could just live. And then hopefully if they were able to get that money so they can buy their property back when Jubilee came, they would be able to do that. But if they were not able to, then they could go to their closest cousin, kinsman redeemer, who would do that for him. But even then, if they couldn't do that, if they didn't do it the right way, that property would be lost. And so if you think about it, as Jesus came to earth to redeem us and to restore us back to our original place. Because you can go all the way back to Adam, losing that right to rule and reign. And then Jesus shows back up and fixes everything. But what we need to understand is it never left God's hands. He's the original owner. And that's what he was telling Moses at Sinai. I'm always the original owner. And it's not legal loopholes. That's not a real thing. There are no legal loopholes. The law is the law. You have to get under it. And you have to obey it. You don't wiggle around it. When he says I'm the original owner, and in the 50th year, if you're following my principles, there's a caveat. If you're following my principles, you fall in under this blessing where you get restoration, you get release, and you get a return. So that's what Jesus was saying. I'm here to do all of that. In a short while, we climb up on that cross, and I will restore all of that poverty that took over you. I will restore you back to your rightful place. Because we belong to God. This Torah portion constantly says we are slaves of God. And it's not the connotation of slavery, but hey, we are bondmen in this faith. Okay, so we are God's slave, and he owns us. We're his property. But he honors us. He doesn't treat us unfairly. He allows us to work a job where we can raise our heads and not be embarrassed of having to earn money to back buy the property. He allows us to walk in dignity. He tells us don't treat each other bad. He says if it's a foreigner or something, still provide for them, still be good to them, still pay them their wages. They need to be restored. And that's what, it's all like this spiritual concept of what God is doing and what he did when he came back as the Son of Man and died for us. He restored us back to our rightful place. So when Isaiah was prophesying that, hearing from God, Jesus walked it out. And then he had the bravery, the courage on a Sabbath day, which is the appropriate time. God is always doing things exactly according to his calendar. When he's walking into the Sabbath he's walking into the synagogue on a Sabbath proclaiming that 50th year, that restoration time is here. He's telling you what he's about to do. He's telling you what's happening. He's letting everybody get on the same page. So that's really important when we understand Jesus is the ultimate kinsman redeemer. He's restored us back to where we need to go, back to where we need to be in God. And he's true to his word. He's not saying anything new. He's saying exactly what was said in Isaiah 61. So let's keep going, because I'm about to run out of my notes. As far as the storyline goes, as far as this kinsman redeemer, but the text is continuing to go on and talk about how the property will be restored, every way it could be restored. He even talks about in verse 31 of chapter 25 about if it's a house in an unwalled village, they're treated like fields. The original owner has the right to buy them back. And they are to be returned in the year of restoration, that Jubilee. But if one is walled up, there was a different rule that you had to do, and that's in verse 30. and also the Levites have the right to buy back any time their property in the cities assigned to them. We remember when we did Torah with Sean about those cities of refuge. So God made those cities of refuge for those people that may have committed a sin and they needed to be forgiven by the priest, and it was the specific kind of sin where they were allowed to live in this city of refuge. But the priests owned those lots, and they were providing that protection. So they fall under a different category of Jubilee. They can restore their property anytime they want. So here we go. In verse 33, if a house in one of these cities is sold by a Levite and is not bought back, it must be returned in that year of restoration, because the houses which the Levites own in their cities are their permanent property among the people of Israel. The pasture land around the Levite city shall never be sold. It is their property forever. So God always has a law for us and a law for the Levites. And he said a permanent promise to them, their territory, and he would take care of them forever. So even if they didn't have the money, like if Bob, who's not a Levite, he didn't have the money, he's got to sell himself, make that money. Hopefully he gets that money and can buy that property back. But if he doesn't, it doesn't go back. But if the Levite still didn't have any money, it has to go back. In that year, the law requires it go back to him. So that's a beautiful protection that God has for the Levites. And so that's what's amazing about Jesus' lineage. He is Levite. He's a Judah. He's from Judah and Levite. So when he shows up in that 50th year, the property must go back. We must all go back to Jesus. So it kind of wraps itself up in that. And we're coming to a close on this. But it's just so fun when you start looking at whose character, like the person playing the part, like they're all alliteration or alluding to what Jesus is going to do. So if Jesus, the Levite, shows up, says, give me back my property, and it's that 50th year, give it up. Cool. Okay. All right, guys. So again, I'm not reading these whole things, but I do want to say this last one at chapter 26, verses 1 and 2. This is the last part of the Torah portion. And the Lord said, do not make idols or set up statues, stones, pillars, or carved stones to worship. I am the Lord your God. Keep the religious festivals and honor the place where I am worshipped. I am the Lord, period. So God starts out in the beginning of our passage saying, when you go into the land. And then he finishes up and says, now that you're in the land, don't get caught up in this idol worship, because we are walking into Canaan. We know what they do. We know how they are, okay? We're not mixing and mingling. We have our different laws, our different systems, our different rules and regulations. We honor our land in the 7th year. We honor everything in that 50th year. And because we honor that principle, everything is restored back to the original owner, which is Jesus. And then if you like the history and the numbers, that 70 years of captivity, it in certain areas it extended longer because they did not follow that principle. But here we are, and it's all fixed up. Jesus made it all good. So